All right, welcome to the third episode of the Theosbound podcast. I'm Nate from Vase and Shao, and I'm here
with Trey from Telos Bound.
and today we'll be talking about a very, very important text from a very, very important theologian. It's called Eternity and Time by Father Dimitri, I don't know, Stăniloae. I have no idea how to pronounce his name. It's Romanian. He's a 20th century Romanian theologian, definitely one of the most important theologians in the past. Well, I'd go so far as to say the past millennium, and I'm sure Trey would agree with me on that.
No, I disagree.
Okay. Well,
no, that's okay. No, I agree. No need to start.
No need to stir the pot
early.
yet. Hey.
Yeah. So, what are we going to be talking about today?
So, well, why don't we just get right into the flesh of the text that we'll be covering? Because I think that it'll be the most beneficial just to kind of start. Well, you know what? I'll just start with a quote that I really liked from it that I think kind of sets the ground for the entire discussion of time. For Stăniloae, time is just a metric of communion. Time is just the, well, let me just use this quote here. So love, this is from Eternity and Time. Love is the gift of oneself to another, and the waiting for the full return of that gift from the other in response. Only in a complete and immediate response to the offer of love is love fully realized and full communion attained between the two. The interval of waiting for the response is time. Okay, so we'll continue the quote. As such, time represents a spiritual distance between persons, while eternity is beyond all distance or separation. And then he quotes St. Maximus the Confessor saying, "The mystery of Pentecost is thus the direct union of those who are in the providence of God with the providence of God himself. That is to say, the union of our created nature with the word of God by the operation of God's goodness. By the operation of God's goodness is a union in which there is no longer time or becoming." So time, like it said in the quote there, is the interval of waiting between the procession of love from one and the reversion of that love from the other back to the one who gave love initially. And of course, this is most fully actualized and most fully realized in the eternity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, where the Father eternally gifts himself entirely in love to the Son through the Spirit, and the Son immediately and eternally reciprocates that love back to the Father. And our created experience of time has its foundation in that procession and reversion of love in eternity, in the Trinity, insofar as it is in the Son that God creates. God creates creation as a gift from himself to the Son, and so creation joins itself back to the Father in the reversion of that love back to the Father in the Son. And our experience of time is just our experience of joining ourselves to the eternal reversion of the Father's love in the Son back to the Father in the Holy Spirit. Right?
I would say yes, I agree with that. And it's so just to maybe emphasize the main point here is that Stăniloae is providing a definition of time. And we like in the Confessions, St. Augustine very famously struggled with time, and he was unable to answer the question of what exactly time is. But it's probably because St. Augustine, he was writing before the essence energy distinction had become systematized and in the way it had been after people like St. Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Palamas, and of course in the 20th century. So Stăniloae is defining time as the interval between the interval between an energy, the divine energies of one person towards another person, and and of course this kind of relates, well, it fully relates to the idea of being as communion in Orthodox theology. Being itself can't be understood as self-referential. So we disagree with certain philosophers who will argue that things, or let's just say Kant, who would say there's things in themselves which are themselves, and we can't know them because they're so far away from us, and we're ourselves, and phenomena, noumena, distinction like that. But the point is that there are no things in themselves that are just self-enclosed totalities. Rather, everything is in communion with each other. And in the end times, in the eschaton, when God is all in all, there will no longer be any interval between the communion of energies between things and between persons. There will be an eternity, a full actualization of time, because all of being will commune with itself in one act of one simple act of, well, simple and complex, infinitely complex at the same time, act of communion. So so the definition of time is essentially just the interval that it takes for the divine energies to go out and then come back to a person. And this is essentially what in Orthodoxy we call communion.
Yeah. And it's important to understand it in the context of movement as well, the movement of one person into another, and then from that person back to the one who initially gave himself to the other. And because Staniloae talks about how the way that we are to understand God as outside of time is not that, or outside of movement, time and movement being sort of, I don't know if you'd say that they're homologous or synonymous with each other. Would you say that time and movement are the same thing, or is there a difference or a distinction to be made between the two?
I would say there's a distinction. I mean, it was Plato who said that time and movement are identical, and this is St. Augustine explicitly critiques Plato here, saying that the movement, like Plato said, the movement of the heavenly bodies was time. Um, Although there's some scholarly debate over that, but in any case, I think there's a distinction between movement and time, but I think you can't understand. I don't think that's very controversial. You can't understand movement or time without each other. So
Yeah. Okay.
they're definitely homologous. They have the same structure, and in the sense, actually no, I was gonna talk about something that I think we'll touch on further on. So continue with you.
Yeah. Okay. So we can understand God as being beyond time in a similar manner, maybe not the same, but in a similar manner as to how we can understand God being beyond movement. It's not because God doesn't move, God is this stationary, static object. It's because God is infinitely moving or infinitely giving himself from the Father to the Son and from the Son back to the Father infinitely. And the response of the Son to the Father's love is simultaneous. So God is moving in, I guess you could say, God is moving so quick and or infinitely quick. It's not just that he's moving so quick, it's that he's moving beyond quickness itself. And because of God's infinite movement from the Father to the Son, back to the Father in the Holy Spirit, it's because of that that God is beyond movement and beyond time. It's not because he's this stationary, static object. And Staniloae really drives that home, especially in the last, let's say, like 5 or 6 pages of his text there. He really emphasizes this and talks about how movement is not to be understood and time is not to be understood in the sense that Origin understood it as a result of the fall, but rather time and movement are just supposed to be understood in the context of our movement up towards God. Because the thing is, if God created us in eternity, or if God created us within the intertrinitarian eternity without us having to move up into that in time, it would just be a self-extension of God into himself. In order for God to have actually created something, there has to be an actual distinction between the uncreated and the created. And the movement of time is the movement and reciprocation of the gift of being that God gave to creation as something distinct to his uncreated self. back to God. And so it is necessarily in movement and in time that we move up towards God and reciprocate the gift of being and love that God gave us back to God.
And it's important, like now that we're talking about the Trinity, we should mention how you already talked about this, but like God is not unmoving. He is the fullest realization of movement, and in this
Right.
sense transcends movement itself, transcends everything in its essence. And well, the Trinity, when we speak of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we're talking about the essence of God, and the essence of God is beyond comprehension. It is beyond any sort of understanding that we can have, and that is because the essence of God is in a perfect communion of unchangeable simplicity, and if we so while the essence of God is uh, simple and in a unchanging act of love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it's it's because this unchanging act isn't understood as it's understood as the fullness of communion as opposed to and the fullness of movement as opposed to the non-existence of movement. It's on this basis that we make the distinction the distinction between the essence and the energies, because the essence of God is unchangeable and a fullness, a perfection of communion beyond our understanding and a perfection of love beyond our understanding. It's on this basis that the energies of God, which stem from the essence, these energies are infinitely and there's an infinite and inexhaustible potential for variation in these energies. So yeah, so the reason why we speak of the energies or the activities of God, specifically in regards to creation, God's goodness, his I don't there's many different, and well, there's an infinite amount of energies of God, but all of these energies stem from the divine essence, and there is an infinite potential of God's activities precisely because God, in his essence, is the fullness of love and a perfection beyond infinity. And this is where the infinity of the divine energies stems from.
Yeah. And there is no way to understand time, communion, any of these things. There is no way to understand it other than through a Trinitarian lens. And I'm going to be doing a video on my channel in about a week or so on the first day of creation, and I talk pretty much for the entire time about how creation necessarily has to be understood through a Trinitarian lens. So to all of you people who are more interested in understanding the logistics of that in biblical theology, check that out in about a week. But anyways, we have to understand that the basis of creation itself and the basis of time itself is in the eternal procession and reversion of the Father's love to the Son, back to the Father in the Holy Spirit. And Colossians 1, I think it's Colossians 1:16, tells us that creation, all things exist in the Son and for the Son. So not only is the Son, in relation to the Father, the archetype for creation itself, as that which the Father gifts his love to, and in response to that, creation as an image of the Son reciprocates that love back to the Father. Not only can we understand creation as created in the Son as an image of the Son, but we can also understand creation as for the Son. God creates creation as a gift for the Son. And so for creation to return or reciprocate that love back to the Father, it has to be done in the person of the Son. And that's why St. Maximus understands that the incarnation would have happened regardless of the fall. And that's not because the earth was created evil, or that movement or time is necessarily evil. No, it just means that that is how God preordained for creation to be brought up into the intertrinitarian love. And of course, because of the incarnation, we can join ourselves in time to the Son through the Holy Spirit in baptism and in the life of the church. And it is in joining ourselves to the Son that we reciprocate the love that the Father gives to us back to the Father. And in biblical theology, this is what undergirds the entire Old Testament. And this is what the entire Old Testament points towards, is the reciprocation of God's love to creation back to God. And before I get too much into that, I want to see if you have anything to say about that, because I do have a bunch of notes on the concrete biblical theology of that. So if you want to say anything before I go too deep into that, go for it.
Well, maybe I'll just say, because I'm working on a video on my channel on Immanuel Kant through a Orthodox perspective. And basically the idea that I'm going with right now is that Kant runs into a problem where he can't grasp objects in themselves, because subjectivity, ourselves as human persons aren't able to leave ourselves, because we're finite, leave ourselves to grasp the object, which just remains external. Everything only appears within the transcendental, within our mind. Essentially, it's not that simple, and for that reason he defines time as just a form of our intuition. So basically it's just like an empty container in which phenomena appears. But I think the problem with Immanuel Kant is he understands things as finite and withdrawing from each other. So objects withdraw from us, when in Orthodox theology, rather than everything withdrawing, objects are always radiating their energies, which is how we commune with them. And time is not just an empty form in this sense. Time is literally as Danilo says, it is the interval of waiting for the response of one. So like we say that we in love, we give ourselves to the other. But I don't think this necessarily only has to be understood as giving ourselves to another person or another human. I think it can even be understood in terms of objects, in the sense that all of being is love, it is communion, and we only have knowledge of objects. Contrary to what Kant says, we don't just have encounter an image of them, we encounter the energies, the operations of the object, which the object itself, in its essence, in itself, it is perhaps it's even impenetrable. Like I know I believe Saint Gregory of Nyssa talks about how the human being, just like God, can only be understood apophatically, in the sense that we can't grasp the essence of another human being, but we can commune with the other person through their energies. And I think that as you were saying, that we have to understand essentially everything, like all the whole creation of the earth, everything has to be understood as communion, because being is communion. And I just wanted to briefly mention how in modern philosophy gets stuck at these epistemological problems of being unable to access the object, and that's because they understand the object as withdrawing, when in reality the object is giving, and we ourselves are giving, and you only have life insofar as you are giving. And I guess that's one of the paradoxes of Christianity, that you only receive yourself, you only find yourself in leaving yourself. And yeah, that's all I would say on that topic.
Yeah, and I remember, I don't know if this is an opinion that you hold yourself, because it was a video that you did a while ago on someone else's work, and you mentioned how time can be understood like the subject insofar it is a negation of a negation, right?
Yeah.
Is that an accurate assessment, would you say, understanding time as parallel to the subject insofar as it is a negation of a negation?
Well, I'm right. I'm writing a big section. I'm rewriting my book, and in my book I draw the whole connection between the structure of time and the structure of subjectivity. And of course, this is getting off topic, so I'll just very briefly, and then you can go on with your stuff. But basically, time understood without communion is the present, a pure present, which is what St. Augustine in the Confessions runs into, the problem he runs into, because he's not understanding time in a in through Orthodox theology, really, because he understands it not as communion, but he realizes that the present has no space, it has no length. It is a pure negation and a withdrawal from the past and future. That's how he understands it, at least. And in the same way, the subject understood in the tradition of German idealism and Zizek, this subject, which withdraws from all reality, like as I was mentioning, Kant gets into the problem of how can we understand objects only because he has the presupposition that the human subject is withdrawing and not communing. And in the same way that time without the past and future, without the communion, time understood as communion, there is a withdrawal of the present into a self-annihilating present moment, which always becomes other to itself. The subject, if it's understood as withdrawal, is in the same way self-annihilating, a self-annihilating void, which of course we talked about in our video on
We
Zizek
did.
in Orthodox Christianity.
I
But
was I
yeah,
was going to mention that video right after that.
so I think I'll be right back in like 20 seconds, but I'll let you introduce your stuff you're going to talk about, the biblical stuff.
Okay. So I don't want to say too much because I want Trey to be here when I really get into it. But something that I do want to mention before I really get into the biblical theology side of, well, I guess all of this technically is biblical theology, but before I go through sort of the biblical story of time, I guess you could say, or what we know about time directly from the Bible, I do want to mention how Trey talked about the present moment, or how time without communion is being stuck in the present moment. And we can understand that there is two different types of present moments, or two different types of eternity, because we can understand the present moment as eternity, because eternity is when there is no past, future, there's just the present. And I think the distinction that we can make between the eternal present of negation and the eternal present of the communion of the Trinity is an eternity of reduction versus an eternity of expansion. And this relates to this all relates to the idea of the self as the void, and hell as the idea of the self withdrawing into itself, and that's the eternity of reduction, the withdrawal from communion into oneself. And because God's gift to us is infinite, the withdrawal into yourself is a withdrawal from infinity into finitude. So it's sort of this paradoxical eternal withdrawal into time, or into finitude, whereas the eternity of heaven, the eternity of the eschaton, is an eternity of expansion, where you are eternally giving yourself to the other, and the other is eternally giving themselves to you. And we can understand the apophatic side of this, or the apophatic side of communion, in the sense that the other is apophatic insofar as there is always more to learn about them, whereas the apophaticism of, the apophatic side of hell, or the eternity of reduction, is you are forever withdrawing into nothingness itself without any positivity to fill that void.
So a simple way to understand this is essentially that time is, if so we can, okay, so there's the eternity of hell, we can say, then there's the creation, the temporal creation right now in time, and then there's the eternity of heaven. Creation in time right now, time is the interval between the divine energy or love, the interval of love, basically, as we've already spoken about, the time it takes for one energy to the divine energies of one person to reach another and then return back. But hell is eternal in the sense that instead of reaching out, there is no more reaching out. So there's no more time, because time is the interval of this reaching out. So it's eternal because it negates time absolutely. And withdraws into itself absolutely. So this is one eternity, but it's not. This is why there's a lot of confusion around just saying, oh, heaven and hell are eternal, but they're eternal in direct opposite ways. And
Yeah.
with there is, even though hell is eternal, us right now, not in hell, in um just in fallen creation, we are closer to true eternity than hell is, even though hell is eternal. Um, even though hell is eternal. So, as opposed to the withdrawal into yourself, so there's no time because there's no distance to be covered between the love from one person to another because there is no love in hell. In heaven, it is time fully actualized because the movement, the communion, there is no interval anymore. So there is no time because the movement is absolute. It happens instantly. And this
Yep.
is the movement of the Trinity. This is the life of the Trinity, where it is movement fully actualized, while hell is non-movement or um, withdrawal fully actualized.
Right.
So they're both eternal, but they're not eternal in symmetrical ways. They're literal opposites. Um, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And uh, on the topic of understanding time and the subject, or in parallel with each other, that's how the Bible presents time and presents the idea of the subject. And to more completely understand, or more fully understand, what I'm about to say here, I highly recommend that everybody goes and watches on the Telos Bound YouTube channel the video on subjectivity and 666, because that's kind of, I'm going to be saying everything that I'm saying here, assuming that everybody already knows what was talked about in that video. So the act of creation, like I said before, is done in the Son and through the Son. Creation only exists insofar as it is covenantally connected to the Son in the Son's relationship to the Father. Okay? Our covenantal relationship to God is the covenant, when acted in faith, brings us into the inheritance of the Son, which is from the Father. And that's why inheritance, covenant, and sonship are all linked in the Bible. Just read Genesis 15. You can't tell me that what God is promising Abraham is not a covenant of sonship and inheritance. It obviously is. There is no denying that. But anyways, this is the covenant which was given to Adam. Adam being the generations of the heavens and the earth, the man, the subject in which all of creation is summed up and then offered to God. The covenant of being given, or the covenant between God and creation, is God giving himself to creation in a creating love, and then creation reciprocating that back to God in man, who sums all creation up in himself, gathers creation, goes out of the Garden of Eden, gathers creation, brings it back up into the garden, and then offers it to God Eucharistically. And note that Eucharist literally just means thanks or thanksgiving. The Eucharist is just our thanking God for creation and our acknowledging and giving back to God that creation ultimately comes from him. We don't have it in and of ourselves. Creation only exists as a gift from God. So this is what was meant to happen on the seventh day of creation, the Sabbath. God, on the 6 days of creation, God created the entire earth, and he created man. And then on the seventh day, man was meant to go out, gather, create, or not go out of the garden. He was meant to open up creation to God and thank God for creation Eucharistically, in order that creation and God might be brought together covenantally in a covenant of marriage. The covenant of marriage and the covenant of sonship are directly related to each other, and I'm going to be talking more about that in my video on day one of creation. So keep your eye out for that if you're more interested in this type of stuff. But anyways, on the Sabbath, man was meant to present himself as a bride to God. He was meant to join himself to the Son and reciprocate the love that the Father gives to the Son into creation back to the Father as a son of God. He was meant to be adopted into the intertrinitarian love alongside the Son through the Spirit and be brought up into that communion with God. The problem is man failed to enter into the Sabbath. And this is the entire idea of 666. Man, or the fallen subject, man locked himself in the sixth day of creation. He failed to enter that seventh day. And this is what it means to be in the flesh, okay? The first time that we see the word flesh in the Bible is when God tells man that man and woman are to be joined together and become one flesh. Again, we see the covenant of marriage here. The marriage between man and woman is meant to be an image of the marriage between father and son, and by extension, the marriage between God and creation. So we have to understand that man being stuck in the flesh is both man's failure to join with fellow man and become one flesh, become one family, man giving himself to man, but it's also the failure of man as a corporate family to give himself, or I guess in this case it's herself, because man is the bride to God as God being the bridegroom. So man being stuck in the flesh, which is a very important biblical thread, especially once you read Romans, and it's something that so many biblical commentators struggle with for no reason at all. Literally just look at Leviticus, look at the context that flesh is used in Genesis, where it talks about man and woman joining together to become one flesh. And in that context, it's pretty clear that man being stuck in the flesh is just to be understood as man being stuck in himself, man being stuck in his own flesh, his own leprous flesh, which is how Leviticus presents the idea of flesh. It's to be understood in direct parallel with the idea of leprosy being covenantal and ritual uncleanness, the inability to enter God's sanctuary, the inability to enter the Sabbath and join yourself to God. And this is also how we should understand fallen time, I guess is the best way to put it, fallen time. And this is what the Old Testament is all about, and this is what the Sabbath is about, and the failure of Israel to keep the Sabbath in the Old Testament. The same way that Israel fails to open themselves up to God because they're stuck in the flesh, they also fail to truly rest on the Sabbath, and they fail to join the present moment to the past and the future, because that's what the Sabbath is all about. The Sabbath is meant to be sort of, how should I say, temporal punctuation. It's supposed to be what joins the past week to the future week. And because of man being stuck in the flesh, because of man being stuck in the sixth day, man in the Old Testament was unable to go into that Sabbath, and man was unable to join time back to the eternity which gives time existence. And there's a quote from Eternity and Time where Staniloae says that time is a bridge between beginning and end, right? So beginning being, and we can understand beginning as being in the eternity of the Trinity, and we can understand the end as being the eternity of the Trinity. And time is the movement from that beginning into creation back up into eternity in the end. And so man's failure to enter the Sabbath is both man's failure to open himself up in the marriage and the covenant of marriage and sonship to God, but it's also man's failure to join the procession of God's love back to God in time, I guess you could say. It's the failure to bridge the procession of God's love with the reversion of God's love back to God in time. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Or do you have anything else?
Well, I can keep going if you want me to.
Yeah, sure. Just keep going for a little bit, and then I'll contribute my thing.
So, what was I talking about? God's covenant, man is in the flesh. Okay, so this is what the Old Testament is all about. And read Romans 7, and you'll hear Paul talking about the law, which was meant to bring life, actually bringing death. And the reason that it brought death was because man was stuck in the flesh, and man was unable to actually fulfill the covenantal faithfulness that was required of him to join himself covenantally to God. Covenants are always two ways. The covenant between God and man to man, and then man faithfully reciprocating that faithfulness back to God. But because man was stuck in the flesh, man was unable to do this. And so when we hear in Deuteronomy 29 that God has presented Israel with both life and death, and it's Israel's choice to either follow life or follow death, we have to understand that that their choice of death, or what am I saying here? In Deuteronomy 29, Israel was presented with both life and death in the law. And the option of life would be brought to them, life being the inheritance of the Son and the blessing that the Father gives to the Son, because it is in joining ourselves to the Son that we inherit the blessings of the Father. So if Israel were to choose life, Israel would follow the law in covenantal faithfulness and present themselves as a covenantally faithful bride to God. But the problem is they were in the flesh. And this is what Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 6 is all about. Let me just pull that up real quick and read it, because this is one of the most important passages in the entire Bible. Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 6. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and you return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. So there's a paradox here. In order for Israel to return to the Lord, and in order for Israel to be a covenantal bride, they have to circumcise their hearts. But in order for Israel's heart to be circumcised, they have to return to the Lord. So it's a paradox. It's impossible. They can't return to the Lord without circumcising their heart, and they can't circumcise their heart without returning to the Lord. So what the Old Testament is all about is the drawing out of man's wickedness and bringing this state of being in the flesh to its very end, in order that Christ may come down and fulfill man's faithfulness in himself. Christ comes down and acts both as the faithful God coming down from eternity into time, and he also acts as faithful man in time, being the covenantal faithful bride to God, acting faithful on behalf of man in time. So Christ is both God being faithful to man from eternity, and man being faithful to God in time. And that's why we can understand Christ as the ladder to heaven. He comes down and he acts as the bridge to which we connect ourselves in time, and by which we connect time back to eternity. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Nice. Well, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the logic of 666, because that was, or the logic of the sixth day, because as you were talking about, in the Bible, self-enclosed systems don't they don't last, and they essentially deteriorate, and that's why we need the seventh day. That's why we need God, who is external to creation, who and it's only through this connection to that which is external and above creation that creation itself can remain whole. And I think this is literally can be proven in basic scientific sense, like a basic scientific sense. And I think science has proven it. And I think once you read scientific and philosophical developments throughout history, which seemingly had nothing to do with Christianity, you see how they point to the truth of Christianity, because insofar as they are true, they relate to Christianity, because Christianity is the full truth. So firstly, the first law of thermodynamics is the conservation of energy. So we're saying, so I can see someone replying to us stating that a self-enclosed system necessarily deteriorates, by saying, well, what about the first law of conservation of energy? How can creation deteriorate and into nothingness? Well, I think that the Christian answer would be is that we don't really believe that. Even in hell, there isn't a nothingness in the sense of annihilation. We don't believe in annihilationism. So how can we understand the way in which a self-enclosed system deteriorates without external support? How do we understand this, the six in becoming the 666, in self-enclosing on itself, barring itself from the seven, how can we understand it as not being essentially being able to sustain itself, self-sustaining. So I think we can understand that with the second law of thermodynamics, which states that everything everything essentially separates. I'm not the biggest science guy, but essentially that everything disperses, every system deteriorates. So this is how we can understand. Let's just talk about heaven and hell, because these are essentially the paradigms of what we're talking about here. Hell, yes, all of creation will never be destroyed. Creation will never be destroyed. Anything God made will not be destroyed. We do not believe in annihilationism, which is the belief that after death, those who are not saved will be destroyed. So in this sense, we believe in the conservation of energy. We believe in the first law of thermodynamics. But insofar as being is communion, and everything ideally and in its to have full being, to have life, has to commune with everything else. This is based on, of course, the Trinity, because God created creation as an expression of himself. Everything separates when it is a self-enclosed system. This is the second law of thermodynamics. So we can understand creation without God as separating and fracturing itself, deteriorating. Yes, it's not being destroyed in the sense of annihilation, but it is every piece is moving further and further away from each other. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the vision of modern science for the universe is literally, this is what modern scientists believe, that the universe will continue on for trillions and trillions and trillions of years, and that all that will be left, because everything, the universe is expanding, everything is separating, there will be a time when, because things will be expanding, the universe will be expanding faster than the speed of light, nothing will be able to commune with each other, and everything will be swallowed into black holes. So the vision of the universe, like the ultimate destiny that modern atheistic science has come to, in terms of what the universe will end up in, is a bunch of black holes floating in a void, infinitely separated from each other.
Yeah. An infinite number of black holes infinitely separated from each other.
Exactly.
Try to wrap your head around that.
And this is essentially, and yes, we would say that it's wrong. That's not going to happen. But that's not going to happen because Christ is risen, because God exists. It's not going to happen because God did not abandon his creation in that way. But without God, that would happen. That is what happens in hell when you abandon, you withdraw from God by your own will. When you withdraw from everything, you are like those black holes floating in the void, unable to communicate with anything else in the universe. So essentially, we can so just to recap all of that, we believe that even though being is communion, it doesn't mean that if you don't commune, if you choose hell, if you choose damnation, and like those are big words, but essentially, if you choose to hate your neighbor, if you choose yourself over others, over God, you are not, there is not an annihilation of yourself, but you are withdrawing from being insofar as being is communion. So there's a conservation of yourself, but you become isolated and not what you were supposed to be. But at the same time, and this would be the second law of thermodynamics, because you have chosen yourself, you have become a self-enclosed system. And because of that, you are always losing, there's always like a deterioration. And hell is simply this eternal deterioration of yourself. So the only solution to this is the seven, something external to the system itself, which is the source of the system and that which maintains it, giving it energy and unifying all of the pieces that without the seven would naturally fall apart from each other. So it's only through God that we unite with others. And that's why, for example, we say love God above all, even before your family. and that might be offensive to some people, this doesn't mean that you love your family less. It means you love your family more, because the love
Yeah.
of God is the basis of the love of everything. And it's simply you to realize that that is the Christian, that is the way out of the fall, is to realize your absolute dependency on God, and putting God before all. And in this way, your love of creation, which is God's creation, will be um, increased. And yeah.
Yeah. And there's a couple things that I want to. Well, first of all, I'm not much of a science guy myself either. So I'm going to say what I'm about to say at the risk of being clowned on by some Reddit atheist in the comments. But the heat death of the universe is kind of I from what I understand, it's kind of like the most accepted model in the science world right now for where the universe is eventually going, which is exactly what you described. And what's so interesting is that it's both a simultaneous movement of everything towards this infernal sameness or uniformity, where everything is the same temperature, where everything reaches absolute zero and there's no longer any movement. But at the same time as everything being the same, there's also uh, an inability for any of those things to relate to each other, and that's because everything is the same. And that's why C.S. Lewis, in his preface to The Great Divorce, talks about how the movement up towards God is both a movement towards unity and a movement towards particularity. You become infinitely more unique and infinitely more united to everybody else, whereas in hell, whenever you struggle with a particular sin, the more you actually take a step back and look at what you're struggling with, the more you realize that it's the same struggle that everybody else has that struggles with that sin. Like sin and evil has no uniqueness to it. It's the same always and everywhere. There is no uniqueness to it, and because there's no uniqueness to it, there is no way for any evil to communicate with anything else. The same way that there is no way for in any particular black hole to communicate with any other particular black hole, because they're all just infinitely reducible points in this infinite pool of infernal sameness and lack of particularity. So whenever you have a lack of unity, you also necessarily have a lack of particularity. Unity and particularity rely on each other to exist, and that's why God is Trinity.
Exactly. So this is something I've been thinking about, and we're kind of getting off topic, but that's okay for now. Like this distinctness or particularity, as you put it. Um, Communion isn't opposed to particularity. Like, I think there's a stereotype that all Christians are just, the same, and like, we all just dogmatic people who do the same things, etc. But it's in communion that things can become truly distinct, because even though, and that's, I guess, the paradox, because um hell is distinctness in its most radical sense, in the sense of you are taking your own distinction and just distinguishing yourself from everything, withdrawing from everything. But
Yeah.
the paradox is that this ends up in everything becoming reduced to the same. You're just the same as everyone else. You're a void of self-relating. You're a void of withdrawing. But in heaven, you commune with others, but you are different from everything else and distinct. And in your distinction from other people, there is your unity with them. And in your unity with them, you are distinct, because things can only be united insofar as they are distinct.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what, and you can see that in just the different liturgical rites of the church. You can see how, because of the unity under which we all join ourselves to in the church, there is room for distinctness to become more distinct. Like if you go to a Byzantine church and a Western Rite church, they they may share a lot of the prayers, and the rites are fundamentally about the same thing, but it is because of the fact that they have that unifying identity, which is the highest unifying identity, which is Jesus Christ. It is because that they're united through that, that they can have these distinctions, which manifest themselves more and more as they become more and more united to each other. Sorry, yeah, you go. I was going to change the topic.
Yeah, I was going to too. What were you going to change it to?
Oh, I was just going to go back to the idea of the Sabbath a bit and
Okay.
how it's presented in the prophetic books. Well, the prophetic books, I'm particularly thinking of Jeremiah right now when I say this, because that's what I've been reading recently. How there is so much emphasis placed on the failure of Israel to partake in the Sabbath rightly, and how their Sabbaths and their feasts have become sins to them. What was meant to be life has become death, as Paul says in Romans 7. But there is one passage that I want to bring up. Let me just find it real quick. I don't remember where I put it. I have it in my notes somewhere. Okay, yeah. This is from Isaiah 56, verses 2-5. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. This part's really interesting right here. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And let not the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So the fulfillment of keeping the Sabbath is obviously in Christ coming down and on Holy Saturday, going down into the deepest pit of hell, and that is the fulfillment of the Sabbath is in Christ going down into the deepest pit of hell and I guess resting, you could say, not shining his light in order that the light of the Father may shine, but because Christ is infinitely joined to the Father, the light of the Father infinitely shone in Christ, and Christ conquered hell. So Christ's accomplishment of the Sabbath is being presented here as a eunuch holding or keeping the Sabbath, a eunuch who is like a dry tree. And I'm going to be doing another video on the biblical story of the thorn bush. And this passage is one of the passages that I use there because of the idea of the dry tree and the eunuch. So that'll probably be up in a couple weeks. But anyways, the eunuch and the dry tree are these images of barrenness, right? And barrenness is is what happens when there is a faulty marriage, right? Or barrenness is the curse on the woman in Genesis 3, the same way that thorn bushes are the curse of the ground in Genesis 3. Barrenness.
Sorry, just interrupt. I just realized that kind of is a perfect example of what we mean by like a barren tree, or even more accurately like a burnt tree, like ash. The fact that distinctness is that wait. Oh yeah, that in the sense that life and like a living tree is unified and possesses distinctions even in itself, and of course is distinct from other things. But ashes are they crumble into dust.
Yeah.
They're distinct from one another in the sense that they don't commune, but they're the exact same thing. They're all just pieces of dust, black.
Yeah, exactly. And we can understand thorn bushes as well as sort of that infernal sameness where there's all these points just sticking out randomly with no unifying these points and thorns towards one single identity. And that's ultimately what the thorn bush, I think, is this idea of this breakdown into multiplicity without an identity. And because there is no identity, no seed from above, which unifies the multiplicity, thorn bushes are barren, the same way the barren woman is the woman who is disconnected from the seed of the masculine, right? And relating to this, of course, we have Isaiah 54, which tells the barren woman to rejoice. And that's a very interesting thread that goes throughout Isaiah, is the idea of how Judah and how God's covenantal people have become like harlots, and they've rejected their covenantal bridegroom. And because of that, they will be made barren. Their cities will be laid desolate and filled with briars and thorns. But just as I read in Isaiah 56, we hear that it is the eunuch who keeps the Sabbath and who holds fast to the covenant of God that will be given an everlasting name that's even better than sons and daughters. The same way that in Isaiah 54, it is the barren woman who will be given a blessing even better than the sons and daughters of the harlot. And who is this eunuch? Who is this eunuch who keeps the Sabbath? It is Jesus Christ, who comes down and makes himself barren in order, he takes upon himself the curse of the covenant, and in doing so, he takes upon himself all of humanity and becomes faithful for the unfaithful humanity. He becomes like a barren woman, a fruitless tree, a dry tree, a thorn bush. And because he voluntarily does that and he silences himself on the Sabbath, he goes down to the deepest pit of hell, to the deepest pit of the grave. The light of the Father shines through him infinitely and destroys hell, destroys the idea of closed off time of the grave. And he opens all things up back to this eternity, which creation was meant to be joined to from the very beginning. But because of man's sin, it was cut off. So Jesus Christ coming down and taking upon himself the curse of the covenant, and in that state of taking upon the curse, making himself like a eunuch, he keeps the Sabbath and redeems fallen humanity and opens time back up to eternity.
So maybe we should talk about the idea of time before Christ being circular. And it's funny that okay, this just reminded me and depressed me about how there's that passage of Staniloy talking about how time, literally saying this, it's not from this book, it's from something else. I'm pretty sure it's from one of his dogmatic theology books.
Yeah, probably.
Where he talks about how Christ broke the circle of time.
Yeah.
I can't find it though, but anyways, so it's important like to note that Aristotle literally says that time is a circle. In the metaphysics or the physics, he literally says that time is a circle. It returns to itself. And the Greeks understood time. This is why the Greeks believed in the eternal recurrence of the same. Everything returns back on itself because they had no idea of Christ. They had no idea of obviously Aristotle was pre-Christ, even though he was preparing the way for Christ, undeniably, as we shall make a video on soon, hopefully. But so essentially, yeah, and like in the sense, modern time is after the death of God. There is a return in a way to this Greek idea of time, but at the same time, there is the idea that there is still progression to time, even in modernity. Like we can't shake, like the incarnation still happened, and we can't reverse our consciousness so much that we truly end up believing in the circular Aristotelian time. And essentially, that's fallen time. That is fallen time, unable to escape itself. And so what Christ does is he breaks the circle. He enters into creation. He enters into the fallen creation. He dies, which is, of course, the curse of fallen creation, the curse of the fall. And he resurrects and he brings creation, or he at least makes a pathway for now of creation back to eternity. And this is why time after Christ, this is why Christianity ushers in a sort of time that is unlike the Greeks. And actually the Jews before Christ, they had messianic time. So messianic time, this is actually like a category of, in the philosophy of time, people talk about this. Jews had messianic time because they were expecting the Messiah, but the Messiah wasn't there yet. So they still, obviously they didn't believe in the pagan notion of the eternal recurrence, but they still believed that their understanding of progress was based on the expectation of something to come, while Christianity truly ushers in the notion of progressive time, of linear time, because Christ is that pivotal moment when the Messiah comes, when time reverses its course from being a circle into being a linear uh, progress. And even in modernity, even though I mean there is the recurrence, the return of Greek notions of time, like especially with Nietzsche and stuff. Generally, the idea of time still is an idea of progress. We've just lost the idea of a true beginning and a true end. So the progress is it's a spurious or bad infinity of progress of just infinite technological growth. That's what the modern world has come to. But even the modern world can't shake the feeling that something has changed. And even if they don't relate this back to Christ, I would argue that this feeling of progression comes from Christ, and it's just a perverted and distorted notion of the progress of Christ's conquering of the nations and the expansion of the church. Yeah.
Right, right. Um, on the note of Christ breaking the circle of time, it's I want to point out a quote from, well, I don't have the quote on me. I'm just going to paraphrase, but Saint Sophrony in His Life is Mine, there's a section where he talks about how Christ on Holy Saturday entered into the true Sabbath, and he didn't just open up the future towards eternity. He opened up the past, present, and future to eternity and to each other. He made or to eternity. I mean, he entered into the ultimate present moment in the Sabbath, and he didn't just open up the future to eternity, but he also retroactively redeemed his forefathers by opening up the past that has gone before him to eternity. And that's why we're able to make icons about the lives of Abraham, the lives of Moses. That's why we're able to make icons about the Old Testament figures and what happened in the Old Testament. It's because Christ has redeemed time. And in The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis talks about how Christ's conquering of hell, Great Saturday or Holy Saturday, infuses every single moment, and how every single present moment is joined to Christ's conquering of Hades, and every present moment thus has the potential to open up towards eternity in itself. And this also connects to the idea that Paul Evdokimov presents in his book, The Art of the Icon, I think it's called. And he talks about how the church's iconography presents multiple events in a saint's life happening at the same time, even though they didn't literally or historically happen at the same time. Oh, I hate that word literally, but they didn't historically happen at the same time, but because of Christ's redemption of time and his breaking of the circle of time, we can present these things accurately and truthfully in a single icon as having happened simultaneously.
And that kind of relates to this notion that a philosopher called Byung-Chul Han has called temporal gathering, in which the present only, he's a very Christian thinker, even if he's not explicitly Christian. The present only has meaning when it gathers the past. It understands itself in relation to the past, and when it is orientated towards the future. And that's what as Christians we should understand ourselves as. We are sojourners in this world, but we understand that we are from a specific history, from a specific lineage, and that we are headed towards salvation. We are headed towards the our end of our lives, and of course, eventually the final resurrection and the last days. But the idea of Christ retroactively giving time meaning is very important because this is why you'll hear people say, if Christ isn't risen, I labor in vain. Because if this activity of Christ never occurred in time, time itself, there is, because of the fall, there's the separation of our temporal world from eternity, but it's Christ who unites eternity with time, and in this sense makes progress possible. um and I was wondering, Nate, because you I know you've talked about before about how modern time is like a return to, in some ways, to the Greek understanding of circular time. I was wondering how you understood this, because for me, um, I see, even though the circle of Aristotle ends in the same way, it's still a circle of hell, in the same way that a hellish circularity, in the same way that an infinite, spurious, bad infinity is uh, a hellish infinity. But I'm not sure if I see, like, just because I guess I haven't thought about it enough, the way are connected. But you would think they are connected in some way, because they're both based on, um, they're both don't possess, the idea of Christ.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Let me just find a quote from Saint Sophrony real quick. That is what actually inspired me to think about how modern time is similar to that circular idea of
Mm.
time, or how they're fundamentally pointing towards the same reality. Let me just, where is it? I have it in an old doc. Okay, here. This is from His Life is Mine, Saint Sophrony. Same book where he talks about how Christ entering into the present moment on Holy Saturday redeems all of time. In the 20th century of New Testament history, the world en masse continues to live as though we were still in the Old Testament, but without even vague expectations of a Messiah to come. Worse, we do not even live up to the Mosaic law. There is suffering on all sides. The air resounds with the groaning of the oppressed. Millions upon millions of unhappy people struggle, if only for a while, to escape death treading on their heels. So, to me, the picture that immediately paints is that picture of the snake eating itself. And we talked about this a bit before, but Father Paul Florensky, in his book, the Pillar and Ground of Truth, or whatever the name of it is, he has this really cool quote, which I don't have on hand, but he talks about how that idea of time, or the idea of uh, death being at your heels, like talked about in Saint Sophronius, like the Greek myth about Kronos, where we get the idea of time from, eating his own children. The product of this circular, meaningless, narrative-less time is just these phantasms, which ultimately are eaten by time itself. So the phantasms created by time ultimately just get consumed by the recirculation of time upon itself. And I think that fundamentally the reason that I say time in modernity and the circular ancient Greek time is the same is because there is no way to distinguish any one particular moment from any other moment when you don't have that narrative of Messiah. It is only when you have the narrative of beginning and end that you can actually distinguish between any particular moment. And everything else is just this closed off circle without a beginning or an end. And there is no way to distinguish, because even if you conceive of time as this eternal line or infinite line that goes on forever, eventually every possible thing that could ever happen is going to happen. And once every possible thing that could ever happen does happen, nothing that ever happened will have any meaning, because it has no particularity. It has no other things to which it can unite with, because in order
Mhm.
for distinction to exist, there has to be unity. And in order for unity to exist, there has to be distinction.
Mm. Yeah, and it's like interesting that you mentioned the snake eating itself, because as G.K. Chesterton says, the snake eats its own tail, but that is a very unsatisfactory meal. So, uh, so like I get what you mean. It's like both ideas, both the circle and the infinite line, they're both bad infinities. They're both infinities that have no final ending in something which is beyond infinite. It's just a continuous repetition of the same in a sense.
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
like, that's why every modern vision of some technological utopia, it's not fundamentally different. There's nothing, there's like,
No.
I don't know if you've heard of Ray Kurzweil. He's
No,
a,
I've never.
he's a moron who believes in, he believes, he literally believes in like 10 years we'll all be in the singularity. So essentially he believes like his vision is so radically distinct. We're all in the singularity, but it's still the fundamentally the same stupid banal reality that we live in now, just amplified. Chad Haig actually talks a lot about this, but in the Christian idea of the mystic experience, there is no mystery to that. And this is also what G.K. Chesterton says, that without mystery, everything just, you think you can understand, everything. You have an explanation for everything, and it's like, uh, and like in materialism, for example, like a philosophy like materialism, yes, it can explain a large amount of things, but it's not a large theory. It's a small theory because everything is just fundamentally the same. Everything is reducible to matter. Everything is determined. So um, G.K. Chesterton also says he's literally probably the best writer I've ever read. And he says, literally, there's no one I've read who is as good as G.K. Chesterton. But he says that he mentions some materialist who says, you, Chesterton, as a Christian, are a slave for not being able to believe in determinism. And his reply is that I believe you're a slave because you can't believe in fairies. So it's like they can. It's like
Yeah,
there is
that's a good one.
with the circle eating itself. There's no idea of mystery because everything is self-enclosed, and Christ is this mystery, which is not just an abstract mystery. It's the mystery of the incarnation, who is here with us, which we can't understand, but we're invited to participate in the life of Christ, in the life of God. And so yeah, essentially the point I'm trying to make here is that both the circle of time, which Staniloy talks about how Christ breaks that circle, it's fundamentally the same thing as an infinite line insofar as they're both spurious infinities of the same, even if the sameness of modern technological utopia fantasies are particular differences, but it's still fundamentally just technology going on forever. In this, like, there's at least no difference in our experience of it than the circle of the ancient Greeks, which is creation going on and on again, ending in fire, as many of them believed, and then being rebirthed out of the fire and doing the same thing all over
Yeah,
again.
it's pointless. Literally,
Yeah,
circles are pointless.
exactly. And it's the circle can be infinite but still small. You can have a very, very tiny circle which is infinite. It will go on forever, but it will be small. But the cross is a shape which it's uh all the points of the cross can extend for eternity, for infinitely,
Yep.
and
Yep.
the shape of the cross will still remain the same, but a circle is stuck in its own little
Yeah.
self-referential
Yeah.
operation.
And that's a really good image that I like that Chesterton uses. That's gonna stick with me forever. I think the circular moon versus the sun, which the rays of the sun which go out forever as the cross, opposed to the circular moon.
And
And I don't
isn't
wanna.
it funny that when like you can stare at the sun and it looks like a cross?
Yeah. Or
Yeah,
when you take a picture of it and it has
yeah,
the. Yeah, maybe that's just, well, what do I mean? Maybe obviously that's just one of the fundamental ways in which God has ingrained himself in his creation.
yeah.
And
Maybe
it's
it's just
such
a
a
coincidence. Hmm.
maybe it is just a
But
coincidence,
as
maybe all of this is.
to quote Chesterton, the coincidence made me suddenly stand still. Yeah, I guess that's
That's a
how
good one. We got to
that's
use that.
yeah, we should. Actually, there's I was gonna say I was gonna talk to you about how there's a lot of stuff we can use for. Oh,
Yeah, I
teasing
gotta
out
get
our.
his I gotta get his book on PDF or something.
Yeah, it's a must read. Okay, so I think we should be getting close to wrapping up. So maybe whatever else you want to talk about, we can do that, and
I
then
there was well, see the thing is when you talk about this or what really when you talk about anything to do with Christ and which is anything at all because everything has to do with Christ. So whenever you talk about anything at all, there always exists the possibility for you to go on for conversation for literally eternity because as soon as you start talking about Christ, you start talking about everything. You start talking about that which is beyond everything. So we could talk about this for as long as we want. But because we exist in time, we have to prioritize our time and we have to spend our time wisely.
here I can even quote Chesterton here as well because the task that's why it's so difficult to talk about this stuff because you just get overwhelmed, and I think
Yeah, yeah,
that happens to us a lot on this
yes.
podcast.
Oh boy.
But and it's like, but that's the problem because what when we believe we don't believe in Christianity because it explains particular things. We believe in Christianity because it explains everything.
Yeah.
And to quote Chesterton, that very multiplicity of proof, which ought to make reply overwhelming, makes reply impossible. So it makes it, well,
Hmm.
near impossible. It makes it very difficult to talk about all of this stuff, which is why we jump around from, and which is
Yeah.
why we haven't even mentioned Steniloi in like 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Whatever.
There is one last thing that is mostly on topic that I want to say before we close off though.
Sure.
And it's about Byung-Chul Han, who you mentioned a few minutes ago, and his idea of the scent of time, which is an image that has stuck with me so profoundly. The idea of time having a scent that uh, infuses every other moment, and how every moment communes with every other moment in this scent, which unifies them all.
Mm.
And I just can't help but think how perfectly that lines up with the idea of the heavenly liturgy and the incense. And in
Yes.
Daniel, we see Jesus arising on a cloud of incense, right? It is the communion between heaven and earth, and ultimately communion in general is done in this cloud of incense, which is ultimately an image of the Holy Spirit who unites all things, um,
And
who
isn't and
unites
sorry,
Father and
just
Son.
and just as Danilo would say, isn't literally that the perfect image of our prayers arising like incense, the incense
Yeah.
arising up? That's the perfect image of time, of this
Yes.
the interval
Yes.
of incense in our prayers, in our love,
Wow.
uh God's love, us accepting God's love and us returning that interval of time that it takes. That is time. That is what time
Yes.
is. Yeah.
I have a perfect quote from Saint Ephrem from his Hymns on Paradise, which I have not read. I just took a PDF of them and controlled F. I control F time and just looked for quotes about time from Saint Ephrem, and I found one and then stopped because, or I found two because these two are just so brilliant. And this connects perfect. Like a priest with fragrant incense, Adam's keeping of the commandment was to be his censer. Then he might enter before the hidden one into that hidden tabernacle. The Adam's keeping of the commandment was to be a censer of incense, and the keeping of the commandment is his reciprocation of God's love back to God in time. So, like, this is just an image that's naturally ingrained to our minds, which we just choose to forget, I guess, because of our perverted view of modern time. Like, that's so brilliant. I haven't really thought about this so much until now, and this is just blowing my mind right here. One other quote from Saint Ephrem. I don't even. Okay, the sense of smell is iconic to be continued. There too did I see the bowers of the just dripping with unguents. I don't know what that means. And fragrant with scents, garlanded with fruits, crowned with blossoms. So the reciprocation of our love back to God, which is what time is. That's literally what Staniloy defined time as. The period which it takes for us to reciprocate the love of God back to God.
Mm-hmm.
The time itself is to be understood in the context of incense, as I just read here in St. Ephraim's quotes.
Right.
This is mind-blowing stuff.
And in this sense, time isn't bad. Like as Staniler talks about, that's a Gnostic idea. That's a Platonic idea. He says that actually I'm not going to be able to find it, but he essentially says that time is not yes, it's a part of the fall, but God gives us this time, and our salvation is supposed to take time. That's why it's actually it's not a good thing to try and go too fast in your spiritual development, but God
Yeah,
has given
exactly.
us this time. So in this sense, we disagree with Meister Eckhart, who says, it's a cool quote, but I'd say we disagree. There is no greater obstacle to God than time, and not only time, but temporalities. Not only temporal things, but temporal affections. Not only temporal affections, but the very taint and smell of time. For
Hmm.
us, in a sense, yes, we are separated by God in time because there isn't yet the full communion where time is fully actualized in the heavenly eternity. But it's not an obstacle to God. It is the opposite. It is the way, as fallen human beings, we enter into the progressive time of Christ, the time of Christ, the resurrected time of Christ,
Yeah.
um, to commune with God. So yeah, and move slowly as long as it takes us into um, into the eternity of the kingdom of God.
Right. And time existed before the fall. Like we have to
Mm.
the fundamental problem that Gnostics make is that they think that they don't have this idea of prelapsarian creation, or they don't have this idea of creation before a fall, creation that was meant to be glorified without falling. They just don't have that concept, which is their fundamental failure and what makes everything they say wrong. But
Yeah.
there's one other thing that I wanted to say, bringing it back to Staniloy, whose name I still don't really know how to pronounce. I hope I'm doing all right with that. But I don't know what exactly the quote is. I think it's in his volume one, The Experience of God, his dogmatic theology books, which are brilliant. I haven't finished them yet, but they are really good stuff. Like, he is so obviously one of the most important theologians ever. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, so he distinguishes between time and space in saying that in terms of the eschaton, in saying that all of space will be fulfilled and opened up towards this infinite mutual interiority. Every particular particle, I guess you could say, perfectly interacts with every other particle, right? Whereas time is not the opening up of every moment to every other moment. It's the fulfillment of time and the absence of time itself. And I don't know if I'm really doing him justice in saying that, because this is just kind of a me paraphrasing an idea that I think I remember reading in his book, and it might not even be true. But do you think that that is an accurate way in which we can understand a difference between time and space? Time being different insofar as it doesn't just open up towards eternity the same way that space opens up towards infinity, or is that just me making something up?
Wait, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Well, I don't even really understand exactly what I'm trying to say, to be honest. But so I know I'm being confusing here, but I'll try my best not to be. Space is fulfilled in the eschaton insofar
Mm.
as every particle infinitely opens itself up to every other particle, and there's this absolute mutual interiority.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas time is not every present moment opening up towards every other present moment, and there being this mutual interiority of every point in time to every other point in time, but time simply ceases to exist.
Yeah, I think I would agree because there is not because if we understand time at because there are no points of time in that sense. If because there are only if we're understanding time as the interval between energies permeating and going out and coming back between points in space, um then when there isn't that division between points in space, there wouldn't be time. But
Right.
I
Oh, you're
think
right,
in the
right, right.
same way, there wouldn't be space in the way we understand space, because if everything is infinitely open to everything else, there there is not a space between me and you. But
Yeah.
in this, like, because if there were to be that space, there would be time, because we would have to cross that space. So the space is always being crossed. And I don't think, I feel like it's just impossible to wrap your head around how space
Yeah.
can be, but we can essentially, I'd say, pretty accurate, pretty on a good we have a good leg to stand on to say that space, in the same way as time, it won't just be negated, but it will be fully actualized. However that will be. We probably can't
Yeah.
fully understand that conceptually, but in the same way, time will be fully actualized.
Yeah. If we understood how it all works right now, then we'd have nothing left to do in time. The whole purpose of time is that we aren't perfect yet. And so we don't understand all this stuff yet because of time existing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a pretty good note to end on.
Yeah. Can I quote Chesterton just one last time?
You can quote
Just
Chesterton as many times as you want.
I like how we just found Chesterton, but or yeah, I don't know why I never read Chesterton before.
Me
Uh,
neither, actually.
he said, "Our our life, no, life and time is like our life and time is our prayers, which arise like incense, which may make us sneeze, but we must wipe our nose and continue praying."
Hmm. That's a good one.
That wasn't just that was me.
Oh,
That was me.
okay. Well, I was thinking like there's no, that is too similar to what we were just talking about for you to just have randomly
and
stumbled
it was like
upon.
and it was like so not good. So
No, the
that's how you know it wasn't Chesterton.
well the part about wiping your nose, I was like, what?
Yep.
The first part was good, and then you lost me.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's like the idea there is you sneeze from life makes you, like, you have step backs, but you need to recover from those step backs and continue
Well,
on.
actually, no, that is good. That is actually not a bad one at all because the whole idea of the curse of Genesis 3, the curse of the fall, is that we have to work by the sweat of our nose. That's literally what the text says, is that we work by the sweat of our nose.
Mm.
Oftentimes it says sweat of your brow because I guess modern people translating it just couldn't conceive why the book would possibly talk about noses in that context, even though literally like a few verses, well, not a few, like a chapter earlier, it talks about how God breathed into the nostrils of Adam and gave him life. But
Mm.
yeah, whatever. But
Mm.
that actually is very relevant because it is by the sweat of our nose that we have to work through time to get back to God because of the fall. So that actually does make sense when you think about it.
Nice. Well, maybe maybe I'm gonna be the next Chesterton. Who
Maybe
knows?
only one
All
way
right.
to find out, and that's to continue working
Yes.
by the sweat of your nose in
Yes.
time.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. The whole This has been a long podcast, our longest one yet. I think we expected that, but
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. God bless you all.
Thank you for watching.